The journey has been long and difficult, but the final revelation is finally within your reach at the end of the road. Stay with us as we piece together the last bit of the puzzle and reveal the truth. Hit subscribe now and witness the most important ending.
My phone rang at 2:37 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I'd been lying awake anyway, the way old men do when the joints ache and the mind won't settle. I was staring at the ceiling of my bedroom in Oakville, listening to the freezing rain tap against the window, when the screen lit up on the nightstand. The name said Noah. My grandson never calls me that late. He texts. He sends voice messages. He does not call at 2047 in the morning, unless something has gone very wrong. I picked up before the second ring, Grandpa. His voice was barely a whisper, tight and cracked at the edges, the way a voice gets when someone has been crying for a long time and is trying very hard to stop. Grandpa, I need you to come. I'm at the hospital. Lakeshore General. But please, don't call Dad first. Please. I was already sitting up. What happened? Are you hurt? I'm not hurt, but they're saying I tried to hurt myself, and I didn't. I swear to God, Grandpa, I didn't. But they're saying I tried to hurt myself, and I didn't. But Dr. Tarby, Hartwell, he's Stefan's doctor. He works with Stefan. He's the one who admitted me, and he's saying I need to be held for observation, and they won't let me leave, and Stefan told them. His voice broke completely for a moment. I heard him pull in a shaking breath. Stefan told them I've been unstable for months. He told them I threatened him, and Dad believes him. Dad was here an hour ago, and he looked at me like he didn't know me anymore. I had my slippers on and was moving toward the closet before he finished the sentence. I'm coming, son. Don't say another word to anyone until I get there. Not one word. Do you understand me? Yes. I love you. 40 minutes. I made it in 32. Let me tell you a few things about myself so you understand what happened next. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a Crown prosecutor with the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General before I retired, the last 11 of those as Senior Crown Counsel for the Greater Toronto Region. I have stood in more courtrooms than I can count. I have cross-examined liars, fraudsters, violent offenders, and people who believed their own stories so completely that they had almost convinced themselves the lies were true. I know how institutions work. I know how paperwork works. I know how a carefully constructed narrative can be built around an innocent person until it looks airtight from the outside. I also know that the first 48 hours are everything. When I walked into the psychiatric intake ward at Lakeshore General, it was just past 3:30 in the morning. The overnight nurse at the desk looked up at me the way people look at elderly men who arrive places in the middle of the night, with that particular mix of mild alarm and practiced patience. I told her I was there to see my grandson, Noah Whitmore, 17 years old, admitted earlier that evening. She told me visiting hours for the psychiatric ward were 9 in the morning. I told her, very calmly, that I was a retired Crown prosecutor, that my grandson was a minor who had been admitted without the consent of his biological next of kin, his father, my son Daniel, and that unless she could produce written documentation that proper consent procedures had been followed, I was going to need to speak with the attending physician immediately, the hospital's patient advocate, and, if necessary, the on-call administrator, because what I was describing had specific legal implications under the Ontario Mental Health Act that I suspected the overnight staff would prefer to address quietly rather than have escalate by morning. She picked up her phone and called someone. 14 minutes later, a tired-looking resident named Dr. Okafor came through the security door and asked to speak with me in a consultation room. I want to be clear about something. Dr. Okafor was not a bad person. She was a second-year resident who had been handed a file by a senior attending physician she had no reason to question, who had told her that the patient was a volatile teenager with a history of emotional instability, that the stepfather had expressed serious concerns, and that voluntary observation was the appropriate precautionary measure. She had followed protocol as she understood it. She was not the problem. The problem had a name, and his name was Stephen Keller. Noah's mother, my daughter-in-law Patricia, died of ovarian cancer 4 years ago, She was 41 years old. She was one of the warmest, most quietly determined people I have ever known, and her death unmade my son Daniel in ways that he is still, I think, only beginning to understand. He grieved badly. He isolated. He threw himself into his work at the engineering firm and left Noah, who was 13 at the time, largely in the care of a rotating series of housekeepers and the goodwill of neighbors. I stepped in as much as I could. I drove Noah to hockey practice. I helped him with history essays on Sunday afternoons. I took him fishing at the cottage in the summers. We became close in that particular way that grandparents and grandchildren sometimes do when they are both, in their own ways, a little bit lost. Stephen Keller came into their lives 18 months ago. Daniel met him through a mutual colleague, some kind of professional connection in the construction sector, and within 6 months, Stephen had moved into the family home in Mississauga. He was 44, polished, financially comfortable, with a wide smile and the kind of easy confidence that reads as competence until you look closely enough to see that it is actually just entitlement wearing a blazer. Noah did not like him from the start. He told me so directly. The first Thanksgiving after Stephen moved in, standing in my kitchen while I made gravy, and Daniel and Stephen watched the game in the other room. "He goes through my stuff," Noah said. He was not dramatic about it. He was 16 by then, matter of fact in the way that teenagers sometimes are when they have learned that drama doesn't get them anywhere with adults. When I'm at school, I can tell because things are moved. And he listens to my phone calls. I caught him outside my door twice. I asked him if he had told his father. Dad says I'm not being fair, that I'm not giving Stephen a chance because I miss Mom. He shrugged, but it was the careful kind of shrug that covers something that hurts. Maybe he's right. I don't know. I watched Stephen Keller carefully at that dinner. He was charming toward Daniel, solicitous in a way that never quite crossed into obvious flattery. With Noah, he was cordial, but distant. The distance of a man who has already decided what someone is worth and doesn't see the need to revise. Twice during dinner, he redirected the conversation that was moving toward Patricia. Once when I mentioned a trip we had taken together years ago. Once when Noah started telling a story about his mother's cooking. And both times he did it so smoothly that I almost missed it. I did not miss it. Over the following months, the small incidents accumulated. Noah told me Stephen had reported to his school that Noah had a history of behavioral issues. Not true, never true. Noah had been a B+ student with a clean record, and the school had flagged it in his file. Stephen told Daniel that Noah had been caught vaping behind the arena, which Noah flatly denied, and which no one ever substantiated. When Daniel had a minor cardiac scare in November and was briefly hospitalized, Stephen was the one who liaised with the hospital, who spoke to the doctors, who managed the information flow, and who, notably, told Noah that his father didn't want visitors, which turned out to be a lie. Daniel had asked for Noah specifically and couldn't understand why he hadn't come. Each thing alone was small. A misunderstanding, possibly. A communication breakdown. The ordinary friction of a blended family in difficult circumstances. But I had spent 31 years watching people build cases one brick at a time, and I knew what a foundation looked like. I just didn't know what he was building toward. Not yet. Dr. Okafor showed me the intake file. I read it slowly and carefully, the way you read documents when you know that every word matters. The admitting physician was a Dr. Raymond Hartwell, a psychiatrist attached to the hospital on a consulting basis. The file described Noah as presenting with acute emotional dysregulation, expressed ideation regarding self-harm, and aggressive behavior toward a family member. It noted a collateral history provided by step-parent, confirming a pattern of concerning behavior over several months. Dr. Cumber, Hartwell had recommended a 72-hour voluntary observation period, which Noah, who was 17 and frightened and alone at 11:30 at night, had signed. The signature of a frightened 17-year-old who has been told by an authority figure in a hospital that this is what needs to happen is not, in any meaningful sense of the word, voluntary. I asked Dr. Okafor 3 questions. First, had anyone spoken to Noah's father before the admission? She checked the file. Daniel had been called after the admission, not before. Stephen Keller had brought Noah in and had been listed as the emergency contact. Second, was there any physical documentation, a self-harm incident report, photographs, a nurse's assessment, supporting the claim of self-harm ideation? She looked through the file. There was a written statement from Stephen Keller. There was Dr. Shu Hartwell's assessment, which was based in part on that statement and in part on a 20-minute intake interview with Noah conducted while Noah was in acute distress. There was nothing else. Third, what was Dr. Raymond Hartwell's relationship with Stephen Keller outside of this hospital? She didn't know what I meant by that. I told her I would be back at 8 o'clock when administration opened, and that I would appreciate it if Noah was made comfortable and not subjected to any further assessments until I had spoken with the patient advocate and reviewed his rights under the Mental Health Act. She agreed, I think mostly because I said it in the tone I used to use when I was telling opposing counsel that we were going to do something, and the only question was whether they wanted to make it complicated. I went to find my grandson. Noah was in a small room off the main ward, sitting on top of the bed covers with his knees pulled up, still dressed in the jeans and hoodie he'd been wearing when Stefan had brought him in. He looked small. He looked exhausted. When he saw me come through the door, he pressed his lips together very hard and looked at the wall, the way people do when they are trying not to cry in front of someone they don't want to cry in front of. I sat down in the chair beside the bed and I said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning. Don't leave anything out," he told me. It had started 3 weeks earlier, when Noah had found a folder on the family computer, not Stefan's personal laptop, the shared desktop in the home office that everyone used. The folder was mislabeled, tucked inside a directory of old home renovation files. Noah had opened it by accident, looking for a school project he'd saved. Inside were financial documents, bank statements, wire transfer records, correspondence with a law firm in Calgary. The accounts were in his mother's name. Patricia had left a small estate, nothing enormous, a savings account, some investments, a life insurance payout, held in trust for Noah until he turned 19. Daniel was the trustee. The documents suggested that over the past 14 months, transfers totaling more than $60,000 had been moved out of that trust account into a numbered company Noah didn't recognize. Noah had taken photographs on his phone. He hadn't told his father yet because he didn't know how, because he was 16 and alone and scared and wasn't sure his father would believe him. He had, however, made one mistake. He had asked Stefan directly about the company name he'd seen in the documents. He said he found it online and was just curious. Stefan had smiled and said he'd never heard of it. That was 3 weeks ago. Last night, Stefan had come to Noah's room after dinner and told him calmly that he needed Noah to delete the photos from his phone, that he knew Noah had them, that this was a family matter, and Noah was going to make things very difficult for everyone, including his father, if he didn't let it go. Noah had refused. He told Stefan he was going to talk to his father. 4 hours later, Stefan had knocked on his door again and said Noah needed to come with him, that he was worried about him, that Noah had said some things earlier that were concerning. Noah didn't understand what was happening until they were in the car. He asked Stefan where they were going. Stefan said he was just making sure Noah got some help. Noah had called me from the hospital bathroom, which was the one moment Stefan hadn't been watching. I sat with my grandson for 2 hours. I made sure he ate the sandwich a night shift aide brought around at 4:30. I told him that what had been done was not his fault, that he had done nothing wrong, that this was going to be sorted out. I told him to keep his phone close and not delete anything. Before I left to go home and change before the administrative offices opened, I asked him one more thing. I asked if he knew the name of the law firm in those documents. He had photographed everything. He sent the images to me right there in that room. I recognized the firm, Castellan and Rowe, out of Calgary. I had dealt with them peripherally years ago in a case involving fraudulent estate management. They were not a firm with a good reputation in the circles I moved in. I made 2 phone calls that morning before 9 o'clock. The first was to a former colleague, now in private practice, who specialized in estate litigation. Her name is Beverly Marsh, and she is one of the sharpest people I have ever worked with. I sent her Noah's photographs and asked her to tell me what she saw. She called me back in 20 minutes. She said what she saw was a systematic and fairly sophisticated misappropriation of a minor's trust assets, that the paper trail Noah had photographed was incomplete but suggestive, and that if the originating account records matched what she suspected, we were likely looking at fraud. The second call was to a retired RCMP contact who now did private investigative work. I asked him one question. Could he find a corporate connection between a Stephen Keller of Mississauga, Ontario, and a numbered company registered in Alberta? He said he would get back to me by noon. At 9 o'clock, I walked into the administrative offices of Lakeshore General and asked to see the patient advocate. The next 3 hours were methodical and, I will be honest, at times deeply tedious in the way that institutional processes are tedious when you know exactly what needs to happen and must wait for each procedural step to complete itself. I will not bore you with every detail. The essential points are these. First, I established formally that Noah's 72-hour observation had been initiated on the basis of a collateral history provided solely by a non-biological step-parent, without documented physical evidence of self-harm, without prior consultation with the biological parent or any other family member, and on the recommendation of an attending psychiatrist whose professional relationship with that step-parent required examination. The hospital's patient advocate, a careful woman named Mrs. Tremblay, listened to this with the expression of someone who has just realized the paperwork in front of her is more complicated than it appeared 20 minutes ago. Second, I requested a review of Dr. Twind, Raymond Hartwell's consulting relationship with the hospital, specifically whether his referral patterns and any private professional associations were disclosed appropriately. I noted that Dr. Hartwell and Stephen Keller were, as I had spent the early morning confirming through professional directories and a LinkedIn profile that Stephen had apparently never thought to make private, golf partners, and co-members of a business networking group in Burlington. I noted this not as an accusation, but as a disclosure question that the hospital's administration would want to address before this became a matter of public record. Ms. Tremblay made a phone call. Daniel arrived at the hospital at 10:15. My son, he looked like a man who hadn't slept, which he hadn't, and he looked like a man who was confused and frightened and had been told a story that was beginning to feel wrong around the edges in ways he couldn't quite articulate yet. I have known my son for 40 years. I know the particular quality of his silences. I know what he looks like when he's working something out. I sat with him in the family waiting room, and I told him what I knew. I did not accuse. I did not tell him he had been foolish, though he had been, because that was not what he needed from me, and not what Noah needed from either of us. I showed him the photographs on my phone. I showed him Beverly's preliminary assessment. I showed him Stephen's LinkedIn profile with the business networking group. Daniel looked at the photographs for a long time without speaking. Then he said, he told me Noah had been cutting himself. He showed me, he said there were marks, that he'd seen them when Noah was changing after hockey. I asked Daniel if he had ever seen those marks himself. He was quiet for a moment. No. Stephen said Noah was embarrassed, that I shouldn't bring it up directly, that we needed to handle it carefully. I said nothing. I let my son sit with that. At 11:45, my RCMP contact called back. Stephen Keller was listed as a director of the numbered company through a second-level holding structure. The company had received wire transfers from a trust account in Patricia Whitmore's name. The transfers had been authorized using a power of attorney document that my contact could not yet verify, but that appeared to have been executed approximately 16 months ago, just before Stephen moved into the family home. A power of attorney over the trust account. In Daniel's name, supposedly, except Daniel, when I asked him 10 minutes later, had no memory of signing any such document. He had signed things Stefan had put in front of him in the months after Patricia's death. Grief does terrible things to a person's attention, but he had never knowingly authorized anyone to access Noah's trust. Daniel's face, in that moment, is not something I will try to describe. Some reckonings are private things even between a father and a son. Stephen Keller had presented himself at the hospital that morning, apparently confident that the institutional machinery he had set in motion the night before would hold, that Noah would remain in observation, that the photographs would be dealt with, and that Daniel, loyal, grieving, trusting Daniel, would continue to be the buffer between Stephen and any consequences. He was in the family waiting room when Daniel and I walked in together. The look on his face when he saw that Daniel was standing beside me, not in front of me, was very brief. A flicker. He had good control, but I have been reading people in high-pressure situations for 3 decades, and I saw it. Daniel asked Stefan, quietly, to explain the power of attorney. Stefan said he didn't know what Daniel was talking about. Daniel asked him to explain the numbered company. Stefan said this was not the place for this conversation, that Daniel was clearly upset, that they should go somewhere private and he could explain everything. Daniel said, "My father is a former Crown prosecutor, and he has already spoken with an estate litigation lawyer and the RCMP. If there is an explanation, I think you should give it now." Stefan said he wanted to call his lawyer. Daniel said that seemed like a good idea. I will tell you that there is a satisfaction, after 31 years of building cases and watching them wind through the slow machinery of courts and appeals, in the moment when someone reaches for their phone to call their lawyer, and you know, with a particular certainty that only comes from experience, that it is already too late for the call to change very much. The formal police involvement came 2 days later, after Beverly had filed for an emergency injunction freezing the trust account and the corporate entity it fed into, and after the document examiner I retained confirmed that the signature on the power of attorney did not match Daniel's handwriting on comparable documents from the same period. Stefan retained counsel. His counsel, to their credit, advised him fairly quickly that the evidence picture was not favorable. Noah was discharged from the hospital the morning after I arrived. Once a second psychiatric assessment, conducted by a physician with no connection to Dr. Hartwell or Stephen Keller, found no evidence whatsoever of self-harm ideation or behavioral instability. The discharge documentation noted that the initial admission had occurred under circumstances that the hospital's administration was reviewing internally. Dr. Selfert, Hartwell resigned his consulting position at Lakeshore General before that review concluded. I don't know exactly what that tells you, but I think you can probably infer. The weeks that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one are sometimes told in ways that suggest that once the truth is established, everything repairs itself quickly. It doesn't. Daniel had to sit with what he had missed, and what he had let himself not see, and why. That is hard work for any person, and harder when the person you failed to protect is your child. He and Noah did not have an easy winter. There were difficult conversations. There were silences that lasted longer than they should have before one of them found the words to break them, but they found the words. That matters more than I can say. Noah is 18 now. He finished his senior year with marks that his teachers said did not reflect how capable he was, which I think is their way of saying that he spent the year managing things that no teenager should have to manage, and still showed up. He has been accepted to the University of Ottawa in the fall. He wants to study law. He told me this over coffee at my kitchen table on a Sunday morning in late spring, when the ice had finally gone and the yard was starting to come green at the edges. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he says most things. But then he looked at me with that particular directness that his mother had. That quality of looking at you like you are the whole of what she's paying attention to right now. And he said, I want to do what you do. I want to know how the system works well enough to not get swallowed by it. I told him that was a good reason. One of the better ones I had heard. I told him that the system is full of people doing their jobs adequately, and also full of people doing their jobs with genuine care, and also full of people who have learned to use the system's own weight against the people it was built to protect, that the only real defense against the third group is knowing the difference between them and not being afraid of the paperwork. He laughed at that. He has his mother's laugh, short and real and a little surprised, like she was always slightly caught off guard by things being genuinely funny. I have thought about that night many times since. The freezing rain on the window. The phone lighting up at 2047. The particular way fear moves through you when it is your grandchild's voice and something is very wrong. I have also thought about what would have happened if I had been someone else. If I had been a grandfather without 31 years of institutional knowledge, without the contacts, without the specific and rather tedious expertise in the exact procedures that govern psychiatric admissions and estate management and chain of custody documentation, I think about the other Noahs, the ones whose grandfathers, or grandmothers, or parents, or aunts and uncles called the hospital and were told that visiting hours start at 9, and that the admitting physician had determined that observation was in the patient's best interest, and who went home and waited, because what else do you do when the institution tells you that the right people have already decided? That thought sits with me. I don't have a tidy answer for it. What I have is this: Noah called me. He knew to call me. Whatever I managed to give him over those years of Sunday afternoons and fishing trips and history essays, whatever it was that made him reach for the phone and say my name first when everything was falling apart. That is the thing I'm most grateful for, not the legal knowledge, not the contacts, the fact that he knew he could call. If you are a grandparent or a parent or anyone who has a young person in their life who doesn't always know how to ask for help, make sure they know they can call you. Make sure they know that when they do, you will come, that you will sit down and say, "Tell me everything, from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." That is where it starts. Everything else is just knowing where to look. There's something I have come to understand, not from any single moment, but from the slow accumulation of decades spent watching what people do when they believe no one is paying attention. Stephen Keller did not wake up one day and decide to become a man who would steal from a grieving child, and then lock that child away when the child got too close to the truth. He became that man gradually through a long series of smaller choices, each one justified in the moment, each one a little easier than the last because the one before it had gone unpunished. That is how it works, not in dramatic leaps, but in increments so small they are almost invisible from the inside. Noah did nothing to deserve what happened to him. He was a teenager who found a folder he wasn't meant to find, asked a question he had every right to ask, and refused to delete photographs that documented a real crime. Those are not the actions of someone unstable. Those are the actions of someone with a conscience, and yet the machinery that was turned against him, the hospital, the intake form, the doctor with his convenient friendship, the signature on a voluntary admission, was so much larger than him that on the night it was deployed, he had almost no defense except a phone and the knowledge that I would answer. I think about what it costs a young person to hold a secret like that alone for 3 weeks, to go to school, to sit at the dinner table across from the man who has taken what belongs to you, to watch your father look at that man with trust, and to carry the weight of knowing without yet knowing what to do with what you know. That takes a particular kind of quiet courage that I am not sure I would have had at 16. Noah did not fall apart. He documented. He waited. And when the moment came, he called. The cause and the effect in this story are not complicated once you see them clearly. Stephen built his scheme on the assumption that grief makes people easy to manage. He was right about Daniel for a time. Grief had made my son trust in exactly the wrong direction. Because when you are in enough pain, anyone who steps in and handles things feels like a relief rather than a threat. But Stephen made one miscalculation. He assumed that the people around Daniel were as exhausted and overwhelmed as Daniel was. He did not account for a grandfather with 31 years of patience and a working knowledge of estate law. What I want to say, though, is not really about me. It is about what happens when a person, any person, at any age, chooses to build their life on a foundation of integrity rather than convenience. Noah had that foundation. His mother gave it to him, and it held even when everything around it was being deliberately destabilized. He told the truth when lying would have been easier. He refused to delete those photographs when a quieter, more frightened version of himself might have. He called me instead of disappearing into the institution that had swallowed him. Those choices came from character. Character is not given. It is built, slowly, through small decisions made correctly over and over, until doing the right thing becomes not a heroic act, but simply the next step. That is what I hope Noah carries into that law school classroom in Ottawa. Not my contacts, not my courtroom voice, but the understanding that integrity compounds over time, the same way dishonesty does, and that the direction you choose, in the small moments no one is watching, determines everything about who you are in the large moments when it counts.